All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning shir. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Cheshvan. Dr. Steve and Dr. Teri Czinn, in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert Czinn Bunim Tzvi ben Chaim, on the occasion of his 18th Yahrzeit. Leah Sol as a zechus refuah sheleimah for her daughter Ilana bas Esther, and for all the wounded in Eretz Yisroel. May our soldiers be safe and secure. Yonason and Rachel Wolff for a complete and lasting refuah sheleimah for Refuel Yitzchak Baruch ben Esther. Zecharya and Sora Wolasky, and the zechus refuah sheleimah for their grandsons Zecharya Dov ben Perel Shira. Ed and Iris Miller in the zechus of the holy soldiers of the IDF and the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel. And our week of learning sponsors, Joel Hosner, in thanks to the friends of the Israel Defense Forces who need our support in this difficult time. Also, yesterday's sponsors, which I apologize, I didn't have. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for yesterday were Michael and Rachel Leibowitz, Le'ili Nishmas, Freda Chana Bas Moshe Aaron, and Ilan Roth, Le'ili Nishmas, his father, Yosef ben Moshe, on the occasion of his 6th Yahrzeit. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the Neshamos will have an Aliyah, the families Ein Nechama, our holy soldiers should be successful in all of their missions, and our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel sheleimah Hashem remain safe and secure in the days ahead. With that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Samech Hey. Today's daf is 65. We are picking up on Samech Daled Amud Beis 64b, and we're picking up 4 lines up from before the lines get wide. So we have a lot to do today. Remember again, the Mishnah was speaking about the interesting case of a man who was Mekadesh his daughter. Right? So the way it worked is he was Mekadesh his daughter, and he had multiple daughters. He did not indicate ultimately again which daughter he was being Mekadesh. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara was talking about, so really there are 2 cases. In case number 1 is being Mekadesh's daughter Stam, just being Mekadesh's daughter. There he had older daughters and younger daughters. So the Gemara says the older daughters are not part of this. Why? Because at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, he doesn't have control over his Bogeres daughter. Therefore, the issue is the Ketana daughter. The Ketana daughter. Which of the Ketana daughters was he Mekadesh? Now, the Gemara then said that halacha l'maisa are actually only dealing with where there's one Bogeres, one Ketana. Well, if there's only one Bogeres and one Ketana, then halacha l'maisa, what's the issue? What's the issue? In other words, only one Ketana. So the Gemara says, what's the case? So here, the Shavise Shaliach. The case here, I say, is where the father has 2 daughters, right? One a Bogeres, one a Ketana. But the Bogeres daughter, actually we also remember we had this Gemara before, the Bogeres daughter made her father her Shaliach to accept Kiddushin on her behalf. So the Gemara says, what would you have thought? Ki makabel Kiddushin adaita didei kamakabel. Maybe when the father accepts Kiddushin, he's accepting Kiddushin on behalf of the adult daughter. Kamash malon lo shavik inish midi di iste hanomine va'avid midi de lesle hanomine. To which the Gemara answers, no, a person doesn't go ahead and forsake something or give up something from which they have hana in order to do something from which they don't have hana. Rabbi said, what does this mean? So remember that halacha l'maisa, when a father is Mekadesh his Ketana daughter, who gets the kesef Kiddushin, who gets the money? It's the father. As opposed to when he's Mekadesh his Bogeres daughter, who gets the money? The girl. So therefore, again, B'pashtus, when the father is going to be accepting Kiddushin on behalf of someone, B'pashtus is going to do it on behalf of the Ketana daughter because he benefits from it. Milo askina and goes to the first white line. Milo askina and Amr le Kiddushelach. Are we dealing with the case where maybe the Gedolah daughter said to her father, if you be my shaliach and you could keep the kesef Kiddushin, afilu hachi lo shafik inish mitzvah deramya alei va'avid mitzvah de lo ramya alei. Nevertheless, I will say a person is not going to forsake a mitzvah that is incumbent upon him in order to perform one that is not incumbent upon him. So let's remember again when we had this Gemara before, we spoke about this idea that the father is vested with the biblical right, and maybe even one could say certain respects responsibility to Mekadesh his Ketana daughter. So even if he's going to get money from both of these transactions, at the end of the day, he's not going to forsake something that is quote unquote a mitzvah. Mitzvah doesn't mean he has to do it. Mitzvah just means it's a biblical right given to him in order to do something that is not a biblical right given to him, but it's just stam shlichus. So I'll say what comes out of the first case of the Mishnah is when a father has 2 daughters, one is a Bogeres, one is a Ketana. The Bogeres said to her father, Dad, can you be my shaliach in order to accept Kiddushin for me? The Ketana, it's his right. He goes, he's Mekadesh his daughter. Right? What happens? At the end of the day, it's not clear. It's not clear who he accepted Kiddushin for. So halacha l'maisa, we assume, the halacha says he accepted Kiddushin for the younger daughter. Why? Because since this is a mitzvah or a right that is given to him, therefore halacha l'maisa, we assume that is the right he exercised and not Kiddushin for the Bogeres daughter. Incredible. We'll say that's kavaita. So Mishi Yesh Lo Shtei Kitim on a second wide line on South 64. Biswas, remember again, now he came into this interesting case of a man who has two sets of daughters. So Rabbi says, so in this case over here, what was happening was as follows. Reuven is married to two women, Rachel and Leah. He has two daughters from Rachel, two daughters from Leah. What happened? So remember again, the Mishnah gave two cases. In case number one, here's what he remembers. I was Makadesh, my older daughter. My elder daughter. So Rabbi says, remember what happened then? What happened then? We weren't sure what does older daughter mean? What does older daughter mean? Now remember, there are multiple variations which then led to a machlokes. Rabbi Yossi said that halacha, well, actually it's before Rabbi Yossi, Tanna Kama said that halacha l'maisa, essentially when he was Mekadesh his older daughter, every single one of the daughters is Savik Mekudeshes except the youngest of the youngest, right? Essentially, daughter number four. Rabbi Yossi said, no, only the oldest of the oldest ultimately again is Mikudeshes. So we'll say they had the same exact machlokes when the father is Mekadesh his youngest daughter. So what does that mean? Same machlokes Tanna Kama Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, and I will say, now the obvious shaila is, why do you need both cases? In other words, they're both illustrating the same concept, right? Which is that Tanna Kama holds. We'll say, in other words, what's the fundamental machlokes? Tanna Kama holds that sometimes people make ambiguous statements. Rabbi Yossi holds people never make ambiguous statements. So therefore, Tanna Kama will say when a father says his oldest daughter, oldest could mean so many different things. Rabbi Yossi says, no, it doesn't. It means the oldest of the oldest. Same thing with youngest. So why need to illustrate this halacha with both cases? If it would have just said the first case of the blessing of the oldest daughter, Rabbi Meir is a Tanna Kama. Right? So ultimately, again, it's only in that first case that Rabbi Meir holds his position. Why? Because Lamaisa, anytime you have a younger sister, you're called an older sister. Aval Baha Ema Modi Rabbi Yossi Diktana Lahach Kitana Dekulu Karilu. But maybe in the case of the Kitana, maybe Rabbi Meir would agree with Rabbi Yossi that when it comes to the youngest daughter, the only girl called the youngest daughter is who? Mamish, the actual youngest. Be Itmar Baha, had it just said the same case, the youngest daughter, Baha Kam Rabbi Yossi, that's when Rabbi Yossi says that youngest, who knows what youngest means? Aval Baha, but maybe in the case of the older daughter, he agrees with the Remeir, therefore Tzvicha. So I'll say the bottom line is you need both cases. Fine. The Memra, they both say, here we go, the Memra. Rabbi Meir Savra Machis Inish Nafshi L'Svega. Rabbi Yossi Savra Lo Machis Inish L'Svega. So we'll say, so now what comes out of this Mishnah, and as I just mentioned before, the fundamental machlokes is, do people make ambiguous statements? Right? That's our fundamental machlokes. So now, based on the Mishnah, what you're saying is, Rabbi Meir holds, people do make ambiguous statements. Rabbi Meir is a Tanna Kama. People do make ambiguous statements. And Rabbi Yossi says, people don't make ambiguous statements. Here's the problem: we see just the opposite. We see opposite attribution. Where this now listen to this. Hanoder ad haPesach. So let's say a person makes a neder. I make a neder. I'm not going to eat cake ad haPesach. Up until Pesach. What does up until Pesach mean? Aser ad shiyagia. Okay, so ad haPesach means up until the start of Pesach. What happens if a person says ad shiyehei Pesach? I hereby take a neder not to eat cake until it will be Pesach. So aser ad shiyetze. So we'll say, so then it means you're asking cake unto yourself until what? Until Pesach is over. So Pesach, ad shiyeh Pesach, until Pesach is over. Now, ad pinei Pesach. So we'll say, so now what happens if a person says, I won't eat cake ad pinei Pesach? What does ad pinei Pesach mean? And I will say, literally means until I see the face of Pesach. What does that mean? Rabbi Meir Omer, Asr ad sheyagia. Rabbi Meir says it means up until the time that Pesach arrives. Rabbi Yossi Omer ad sheyetze, until Pesach leaves. Now I will say, now watch what's happening over here. In that case, let's work backwards. Rabbi Yossi is saying until Pesach is over, because Rabbi Yossi is not sure what does ad pinei Pesach mean. Doesn't mean up until the beginning of Pesach, up until the end of Pesach. So he errs on the side of caution, and then says up until the end of Pesach. Rabbi Meir says no, it means up until the beginning of Pesach. So what in this case, what do you see over here? Rabbi Meir is the one who says people don't make ambiguous statements. Rabbi Yossi says yes, they do. It's the exact opposite of our Mishnah. Don't worry about it. No, ultimately, again, switch around. The attribution in Nidarim is incorrect, and switch it around. Align the positions of the Mishnah and Nidarim, ultimately, again, with our Mishnah, and really it should be that when you say Ad Pnei Pesach, really Rabbi Yossi says up until Pesach, and Rabbi Meir says ultimately again until the end of Pesach. So the Rabbi Tanya kol ze'aklal kol shezmano kavua va'amar ad pnei. Yet also we learned in the Brisa. Anytime you have something that is fixed, a fixed event, and you use lotion of ad pnei, like we just saw by Pesach, Rabbi Meir omer ad sheyetze. Rabbi Meir says ultimately again until it's over. Rabbi Yossi Omer Achi Yageh. So I'll say this Brisa, this V'atanya is being brought as a support to what we just said. Switch around the positions of Nidarim, namely in Nidarim and Ad Pnei. Rabbi Yossi will say up until the beginning. Rabbi Meir will say up until the end, because again, that aligns with our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir says people do in fact make ambiguous statements. Rabbi Yossi says no, they don't. Amra Abaye. So we'll say so that's just understand, which is just also such a fascinating machlokes in just how people talk, right? Rabbi Yossi says people speak in a defined fashion. People say what they mean, and they don't use ambiguous or couch terms. Rabbi Meir says, what are you talking about? People do that all the time. I mentioned this many times. Rav Pam, Father Shiva Torah Bracha said, you know what the worst word in the English language is? The worst word? Whatchamacallit, right? Why? He says, if a person is saying whatchamacallit, it means they have not fully thought through what they want to say. And a person should never say anything until they're 100% sure exactly what they want to say and how they want to say it. So that seems to be in line. With Rabbi Yossi's position. People are defined and measured in what they say and how they say it. Rabbi Yossi says, no, they're not. So that's the machlokes. Here we go, we'll say. Let's go back there. So Rabbi Yossi Omer, Amr Abaye says, we'll say second to last line, Samach Talmud 64b. Amr Abaye, machlokes b'shtei kitei banos. The machlokes ultimately, again, is when you have two different sets of daughters. So we'll say, so remember again, the machlokes in our Mishnah, right? Reuven says, I was mekadesh my older daughter, Biti Agdola, my oldest daughter, or my older daughter. So remember again, the shaila is, what does that mean? So the Gemara says that whole ambiguity is only when there are two sets of daughters. He's married to Rachel, he has two daughters from her. He's married to Leah, he has two sets of daughters from her. Aval, however, again, Abaye posits, because Achos, let's say Reuven only has one group of daughters. Let's say Reuven is married to Rachel, Baruch Hashem, they have three daughters. Reuven says, I was mekadesh my older daughter. In that case, the Gemara says, Divrei Akol Kidola Mamish, Kitana Mamish, Emsois Bishma Karila. In that case, also when there's one set of daughters, everyone agrees. Who's the oldest? The biological oldest. Who's the youngest? The biological youngest. And the middle daughter is referred to just as the middle daughter. So it's interesting. So the ambiguity only comes when you have two sets of daughters. But if you have just one set of daughters, then again, oldest means the oldest, youngest means the youngest, and again, if you're talking about the middle daughter, you'll be referring to her as middle daughter. Incredible. Only Rav Bar Mas, La Abaye, Elamiata, we'll say Tav of Samachay 65a, Elamiata, Emsois Shebekas Shnia Tishtari. So we'll say, if that's the case that Halacha L'maisa, middle daughter, is always referred to as middle daughter, then even in the case of two sets of girls, ultimately, again, the middle daughter in the second set should ultimately be freed from any of this ambiguity, because Bepashtos, she would be referred to as middle daughter. Hakam asking, what's the case? Rabbi say the case that we're dealing with over here is not a case of three girls in each set, but rather again a case of just two girls in each set. So the Gemara says, this seems to be the case. The im Isa, because ultimately again, if there was actually a middle daughter involved over here, so the Gemara says, she should have been stated. And according to that logic, Emtsoz Shebekas Rishona, the middle daughter of the first set, Devadai Sveka Va'asirala. Ultimately, Rambam says she is under the specter of this suffix, right? Because remember, again, we're not sure, is she the Gedola, is she the Kitana? So the Gemara says, Mikatanila. Is she mentioned explicitly? No. Hachi Hashta Hasam, was a first wide line, Samechem Il Aleph, 65a. Hachi Hashta Hasam, Tana, Kitana Dida Li Isura, V'hua din lahach dikashisha mina. So we'll say the way that the Mishnah is written is ultimately, again, the kitana of that group is aser, and the one who is older than her is under the cloud of this ambiguity as well. Hacha im isa diika nisne. But in our case over here, if there really was a middle sister, she should have been mentioned more explicitly. Amali Rafuna Brit Rabbi Yeshua Rava Ha Pesach Dichi Kat Achas Dami Upligi. Here about the Pesach case we said before about Nedarim is the equivalent of having one group of children, and yet again we see that Allah Chalamai said there is still the Machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. Amali Hasam Belishna Da Amak Kamifligi. We both say by the Pesach case. We also say that was the case of Ad Pnei Pesach. A person makes an edge. I won't eat cake until Ad Pnei Pesach. What does that mean? Shabbos said that's a machlokus in something else. Hasam belishna da'ama kamiflagi. Both said that's just a machlokus in verbiage. Mar savar ad pnei Pesach ad kamei Pesach. One opinion says ad pnei Pesach means up until the arrival of Pesach. Umar savar ad mifnei Pesach. And the other opinion says no, it means until the end of Pesach. Good. Shabbos say so. Bottom line, I will say, how do we paskin in this case? So, in general, in this case over here, where let's say again you have Reuven, let's focus on the core case in the Mishnah, where you have Reuven going ahead. You have Reuven going ahead and saying, "I was mekadesh my older daughter or my younger daughter." And the case in the Mishnah is he has two wives, Rachel and Leah. Let's say 3 daughters with each. So, what is the halacha? So, I said, the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yossi. Like Rabbi Yossi, that people make definitive statements. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, when a father was mekadesh his older daughter means the oldest daughter. She is the only one who is mikudashas, the rest are not. When he says my younger daughter, younger means youngest daughter, and the rest, there's no suffix regarding it. And that's how the Rambam paskins, like Rabbi Yossi. Incredible. We'll say a very tremendous Musar Haskell for us also, about how to be careful with how we speak. Right, that Rabbi Yossi is modeling for us that when we speak, we should be measured, and when we speak, we should be precise. Also, if you think about it in relationships, how often is friction created because people make open-ended statements, right? Or people make ambiguous statements. In life, it is so much better just to say what you mean, to say how you feel, and to be directed in your words. Try to eliminate ambiguity from how you speak. Try to eliminate the whatchamacallit factor from how we speak. We should only speak when we know what we want to say and how we want to say it. And especially when interacting with our loved ones, we should try to speak in a way that doesn't leave our words open to interpretation, especially negative interpretation, but rather what we speak should be a clear conveyance of how we feel and what we truly mean to convey. Incredible. Says the Mishnah, listen to this case. Right? Reuven goes over to Rachel. Right? Reuven says, Rachel, I was mekadesh you. V'hi omeres lo kidashtani. She says, no, you didn't. Shtickle awkward. So the Gemara says, Hu aser b'krovosal, v'hi muteres b'krovav. So this is an interesting case. So I will say, he is not permitted to marry her relatives, but she is permitted to marry his. And I will say, this Rashi points out over here, this is the concept. Look at Rashi. Rashi is a little bit further down on the page. Hu aser b'krovosal, d'shavinu alei chaticha d'isura b'hodasa. So I will say, this is, we've seen this concept many times throughout Shas, Shavye anafshe chaticha d'isura. We'll say, sometimes I make a statement, and halacha l'maisa, my statement by itself is not enough to create realities for other people. But who is it enough to create realities for? For me. So if Reuven goes over to Rachel, he says, I was mekadesh you. And Rachel says, no, you were not. Right? So remember, they're not married. They're obviously with Torah, there's no edus. They're not married. However, because he said that he married Rachel, therefore what? He is usher to marry any of Rachel's relatives. So he can't marry Rachel's mother, can't marry Rachel's sister, can't marry Rachel's daughter. Okay? But she, on the other hand, Rachel, is free and clear. So she could accept Kiddushin from his brother, from his father, from his son, and there's no problem. Similar case, Hilmaris Kidashtani. She says, right, Rachel is over to Reuven, you're Mekadesh me. V'omer lo Kidash dich. He says, nope. Who mutar b'krovosal? So same, also just the opposite case. He is permitted to marry her relatives. V'asur b'krovav, but she is not permitted to marry his relatives. Third case, kidashtich. Reuven says, "Torah, I was mekadesh you." V'yomeres, no, lo kidasht elabiti. No, sorry, you might get a little bit confused. People say like I look like my daughter all the time. But, right, you weren't mekadesh me, you were mekadesh my daughter. You were mekadesh my daughter. So what's the halacha? Who asar b'krovos gidola? So remember, now he's persistent. He says, no, I wasn't mekadesh your daughter, I was mekadesh you. So we'll say, once again, he is not permitted to marry her relatives. Who asar b'krovos gidola? Ukitol mutras b'krovav. She, Rachel, is permitted to marry his relatives. Who mutar b'krovos kitana? He is permitted to marry the relatives of the kitana. Kitana mutras b'krovav. Now we'll say the kitana is permitted to marry the relatives of Reuven, right? Because the Kitana, remember again, is not making any counterclaim. Next, Kidashti es biteich. Reuven says to Rachel, Rachel is Mekadesh your daughter. V'yomeres lo kidasht ela osi. Rachel says, no, you were Mekadesh your daughter, you were Mekadesh me. Who also b'krovos Kitana? He is not permitted to marry any of the relatives of the Kitana. Ukitana mutaras b'krovo, but the Kitana is permitted to marry his relatives. Who mutar b'krovos Gidola? He's permitted to marry Rachel's relatives. Ugidola asa b'krovav, but Rachel is prohibited to marry his relatives. So we'll say, so again, all of these cases, I was going to ask, all of these cases are the same. Right? So bottom line, when someone makes a claim that they're married to someone else, remember again, that claim by itself does not create the halachic reality. Why? Because it's just one person saying something, right? There's no edus, there's nothing else. So l'maisa, the only thing that claim does allow for is shavi anafshe chaticha di isura. At the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, you prohibit yourself ultimately to the relatives of the woman whom you are claiming you are married. And again, the reverse case works as well. If a woman claims that she's married to a particular man, doesn't create Kiddushin, but does prohibit her to the relatives of the man she claims she is married to. I asked the Gemara, the Avi's kasha utzricha. Why do I need all these cases? Why do I need all of these cases? See, here we go. Says the Gemara. Utzricha, the all needed the Ashma gabe didei. Let's listen to this. I would say, halacha l'maisa, right? When ultimately, again, when Reuven goes over to Rachel and he said, listen, I was mekadesh you. Rachel says, no, you were not. So what's the halacha? So he is prohibited to her relatives. She is not prohibited to his relatives. So I need that case. Why? Listen to this. This is great. Sometimes guys just get married, right? In other words, that it could just happen that lamaisa again lo ichpas. Look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says, "Gabe didei kiamar kidashtich lo misra ihi bikravav mishum diihu shakuri mishaker the gavra lo ichpas leim oser asma bikravav seachinam." But say sometimes men lie about this stuff. Apparently, they'll just claim that they were married to someone. They weren't really married to someone. Rabbi say for one simple reason. Why? Because it's going to sound strange. It doesn't impact the man so much, right? Why doesn't it impact the man so much? He can marry more than one wife. Okay, so he's going to be usher to the relatives of this woman. Fine, right? There's more, what is it? There's more fish in the sea, right? So it's fine. So he'll be usher to relatives, but fine. So therefore, by a man, you could see why we would not take this statement so seriously to prohibit the woman as well. However, aval ihi, Ema ilav dikim ibedibura lo haves amrs v'lisser ihu b'kravosel. I would say when a woman makes the claim, right? The woman says that you are mekadesh me. I would say that's much more significant. A claim like that, like the stakes are very high for a claim like that. We would think, therefore, by definition, a woman would never say that unless, of course, it's true. And therefore, when she makes that claim, not only should she become prohibited to his relatives, but he should become prohibited to her relatives. Kamash malon. Women sometimes make untrue statements as well. Right? That's the kamash malan. Sometimes that a man might be flippant in this. I would say, do not comment on this. I see the cross conversation happening, right? I just want to say, so sometimes, right? So ultimately, again, sometimes the statements will be made as well. Sometimes everybody makes flippant statements that aren't actually truthful. Good. Let's go right there. Next, kidashtich v'hiomeres hasul. So why do I need the next case? So the Gemara says hasulam li'itzrich. Sadai Tamina Midarais Himene Rachman La'av Midrabane. So we'll say, remember the next case was Reuven claims Reuven claims it was Mekadesh Rachel. Rachel says, we're not Mekadesh, we're Mekadesh my daughter. So we'll say, so listen to this. I would have thought as follows. Since Midoraisa, the Torah gives a father the ability to Mekadesh his daughter, I might have thought Midrabanan Henua Ledidei, Vitissar Barta Bedibura. I might have thought that maybe Midrabanan we believe a mother to say that her daughter is Mikudashas. Kamashmala, no, we don't. Kamashmala, we don't. Okay. Kidash Des Bidech, Hasun, what do I need this next case? So remember again, this is where Reuven says, I was Mekadesh your daughter. Rachel says, no, you were Mekadesh me. So what's Allah? Hasulam Ali, Aili de Tanaha, Tananamiha. Once we quoted the first case of the daughter, we quote the second case of the daughter as well. Okay, so we'll say, so bottom line, all of the cases are necessary because each of them has their own nuanced difference, but bottom line, they're all operating on the same halachic principle, which is, when you create Isser for yourself, you create a new reality for you. But that new reality cannot impact anyone else. Good. Now, obviously, this opens up another interesting point over here. So the Gemara says as follows. Itmar. Rav Amar Kofin, Ushmuel Amar Mavakshin. Rav says we force Ruvain to give a get, and Shmuel says we request from Ruvain to give a get. So the Gemara says, what are we talking about over here? Ahiyah, which case is this going on? Ilema Aresha, if you want to say it's the Resha, so Rabbi say, Lav Kofinika, Velo Mavakshinika. Now remember, the Resha case is where Reuven goes over to Rachel. He says, Rachel, we're married. Rachel says, no, we're not. So Rabbi say, what's the impact of Reuven's statement on Rachel? What's the impact of Reuven's statement on Rachel? 0. Remember, the impact is on Reuven because Reuven says Reuven can't marry her relatives, but there's no vestige of marriage over here. So there's no forcing him to give a get. There's no requesting of him to give a get. There's no get. There's no get. Ella as-seifa. So I'll say maybe it's on a seifa. So bishlam of actions. I understand. Ultimately, again, we request. And I both say the Sefer Rashi says over here, the Amra Kidashtani the Baigen. So we'll say the Sefer they're referring to is really case number 2. Where ultimately again, Rachel says to Reuven, you are Mekadesh me. You are Mekadesh me. So the Mishnah says, in a case where Rachel claims you are Mekadesh me, and Reuven says, no, I wasn't. So remember again, I both say, what did the Mishnah say? What's the impact of that statement? Rachel says to Reuven, you married me. Reuven says, no, I didn't. What's the impact on Rachel on that statement? What's the impact? She's usher to his relatives. He's not usher to. So now the Gemara introduces. Now the Gemara says, by the way, Rav says in that case we force Reuven to give her a get. Shmuel says we request from Reuven to give her a get. So the Gemara says, so bishlam mavakshel l'chayis. I understand you could request from him to give her a get. Elakofin amai, but I don't understand how can you force Reuven? Reuven's claiming I never married her. Right? I never married her. So how can you force Reuven to give her a get in that situation? Amar lo necha le itzar b'krevei. And I both say, they say to yourself, Reuven, what's the big deal? Just give her a get. Reuven says, no, it is a big deal because the truth is I've been dating her sister. So like if I give her a get, then what? I become prohibited in her relatives, to her relatives. So Lamaisa, it's not just stam, just give her a get. There's a ramification for that. Ella shmeisa hadadi itmar. Rather, Rabbi kind of collapse these statements together. How so? Amar Shmuel mevakshin mimena litin get. So Shmuel says, well, say in this case where Rachel comes along and Rachel says like this, right? Rachel says, Reuven, you married me. Reuven says, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. So now we'll say, what's the halacha? So first of all, the core halacha is she is prohibited to his relatives. He is not prohibited to her relatives. But now there's a follow-up. What's the but? Shmuel says, we request from him to give her a get. Look, you've got a lady claiming, Rachel's claiming that she's married to Reuven. Reuven said, I don't know what you're talking about. I never met you before in my life. Right? So now we ask Reuven, okay, maybe just give her a get. That way that just erases any vestige, any possibility that something's going on over here. So Amarav, in Nasan get me asmo, Kofin osolitain ksuvo. Oh, listen now, watch this. So Shmuel says, we request a get. Rav says, by the way, if he gives a get of his own volition without being asked, then we force him to give a ksuva. Now listen, what's the pshat of that? What's the pshat? Because Rachel's claiming we're married. Reuven is claiming no, we're not. But then Reuven just says, I'll just give you a get. But if Reuven gives her a get of his own volition, kind of what does that indicate to us? Something's probably happened over here. So if you gave her a get of your own volition without being asked, then we're going to force you to give a ksuva as well. Incredible. Seif Marnami. So as you have right, Amarav Acha Barada Amarav, Amarav Acha Barada Amarav Hamnuna, Amarav Kofin Umevakshin. We force and we request. So the Gemara says, Tarti? How does that work? Kofin umavakshin. So the Gemara says, Hachi kamar mevakshin mimeno litain get. We ultimately ask him to give a get, because again, that just erases any possibility of anything happening over here. Vim nasa mi'atzmo. However, again, halacha l'maisa, if you went ahead and gave it of your own volition, kofin also litain ksuva. It's mostly interesting, right? So in other words, if he doesn't give a get of his own volition, we ask him to do so. Now, if he refuses, what do we do? Nothing. We ask him. If, however, he gave a get of his own volition without being asked, that tells us that maybe there's a little something going on over here. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, we'd force him to give ksura. We'll say, if you look at that phrase, kofin of action, we'll say it's such a good phrase in our avodas Hashem, right? That how does a yid kind of go ahead and approach his service of Kadosh Baruch Hu? Kofin of action. We'll say you have to approach one's relationship with Kadosh Baruch Hu. There's kfiyah. There's an element of compulsion. We're soldiers, right? There's kafalim harkigigis. Kadosh Baruch Hu suspended the mountain over us. There's a sense of duty. And I will say, because he has to start with a sense of duty, because if my relationship with Hashem is just because I want to, what's the problem with that? What's the problem? What happens when I wake up one morning and I just simply don't want to? So there has to be an element of compulsion in my relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's kofin. Or mevakshin. But then ultimately, again, there's a part of me that wants to do it because I want to do it as well. There's a bikush. But kfiyah, the sense of duty, the sense of commitment, the sense of obligation, that has to come first. And then ultimately, again, the mevakshin, the willingness to commit, that ultimately comes after. I'm Rav Yehuda. HaMekadish be'ed echad in choshesh in the Kiddushin. So I will say, so now, remember all of these cases, right? The beauty or the fascinating part of all of these cases is there's no edus, right? The Mishnah is operating in a case where one party, right, says, you married me, right? Reuven says, I was married you. Rachel says, you married me. So again, essentially the overarching principle is, Shavye nafshei chaticha d'isura. Person could create a state of Isser for themselves. Fine. Now we've also seen that halacha l'maisa, when Rachel says, you married me, we request from Reuven to give her a get, just to be done with it. Reuven gives a get of his own volition, then without being asked, that tells us there's something going on over here, we force him to give a ksuva. Next case, Amar Yehuda, HaMekadish be'ed echad. It's an interesting case. What happens if a person, right, Reuven is Mekadish Rachel, in the presence of an eid echad, one witness. What's the impact of being mekadesh a woman in the presence of an eid echad? So what's the halacha? In choshesh and the Kiddushin, Rabbi Yehuda says it's meaningless. In other words, eid echad is the same thing as doing Kiddushin in front of no one. There is no impact to an eid echad. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, we'll catch up later. So the Gemara says, in choshesh and the Kiddushin. Babinei Rabbi Yehuda, shnei emodimai. Wow, listen to this. Rabbi say, what about the following case? Reuven and Rachel, right, both admit that they are married to each other. It sounds like a strange case. Like, everything is fine, there's no problem over here. Yeah, no problem. Right? Reuven says we're married, maybe even happily. Right? Rachel says we're married, most probably happily. Right? And then what happens? And the Eid Echad says, yes, they're married. So you have husband and wife agreeing that they're married, and the Eid Echad backing up this claim. Is that enough halachically to tell us that there is a valid marriage in front of us? So what's the halacha? So they asked Rabbi Yehuda this question. So in velov rafya biyadei. So sometimes Rabbi Yehuda said yes, sometimes Rabbi Yehuda said no. He wasn't clear about the halacha. He wasn't clear. Say itmar. So we'll say, let's analyze this for ourselves. Rashi says over here, in velo lahaya machzik b'dvarav lo le'isra v'lo leheter pam sha'amar hein upamim sha'amar lav v'rafya biyadei v'lo haisa muchzekes hora azu biyado. Wasn't sure. Sometimes he said yes, sometimes he said no. He wasn't sure. Itmar Amrav Nachman Amr Shmuel HaMekadish be'ed echad in choshesh and Kiddushin. If Reuven is Mekadish Rachel in the presence of an eid echad, ultimately again we're not choshesh for the Kiddushin. The Gemara says Va'afilu shneihem modin, and even if both of them admit. So both says now the Gemara is making a definitive statement that an eid echad by Kiddushin, even when both Reuven and Rachel admit, so to speak, that they are married, it still doesn't work. Still doesn't work. So the Gemara says, Eisvei is a kasha to this. Eiser Rav Nachman, Sora Rav Kasha Rav Nachman, HaOmer Leisha Kidashtich. Back to our Mishnah. Reuven says to Rachel, I always mekadesh you. V'yomer lo kidashtani. She says, no, you didn't. So what does the Mishnah say? He is prohibited to her relatives, but she's permitted to his relatives. Now, let's analyze this. Now, if there are witnesses here, amai mutares bikrovav. So then, of course, we'll say, if there are witnesses, then why would she be permitted to his relatives? If there are no witnesses, amai asa bikrovav. So we'll say, if there's no witnesses, then why should he be prohibited to her relatives? Rather, it must be elalav be'ed echad. It must be that halacha l'maisa there's an eid echad. There's an eid echad. So you see from here that an eid echad does work to some degree. To which the Gemara says, no, hachama askinu, what's the case? Kigon do amarla kidashtich bifnei ploni uploni, right? Bifnei ploni uploni uploni. I'm sorry, bifnei ploni uploni. Baholchu lahem lemedinas hayam. Interesting, I will say. The Gemara suggests that the case of the Mishnah is where Reuven says to Rachel, I married you, and I was mekadesh you in the presence of two witnesses. Those witnesses are no longer here, right? They went overseas. So therefore, I'm going to say there's no eidos involved in the case of the Mishnah. So again, so therefore, remember, what are we trying to figure out over here? We're focused on a simple case. Reuven and Rachel both claim they are married to each other. The only corroboration of their statement is in Eid Echad. That is the Eid Echad in this case, where you have the agreement of husband and wife. Does that create a halachic marriage or not? So Eisli Mar's Kasha was an interesting case. Hamagar Shesishto. We'll say, watch this case. Reuven and Rachel were married. Reuven and Rachel got divorced. Then what happens? Velana ima bapundiki. Reuven and Rachel stayed in the same hotel one night. After they were divorced. So it says, what's the shayla? So Beis Shammai says that halacha l'maisa they don't require a get sheni. I will say now, what's at play over here is, did they have relations, right? And if they have relations, essentially we look at those relations as a second act of Kiddushin. Now remember again, a couple that gets divorced can get remarried as long as what? The wife has not married anyone else in the interim. So I will say, so now they were married, they got divorced, now they're sleeping in the same place. So now I will say, so the shaila is, do we assume that they were intimate with one another, thereby affecting another act of Kiddushin? So Beis Shammai says no. There's no need for a second get. We assume that ultimately, again, there was no bia for the sake of Kiddushin. Beis Hillel omrim tzichem and a get sheni. Shimon says no. We have to assume that ultimately, again, they were intimate with each other, and that bia was for the sake of affecting Kiddushin. They both say they could choose to stay married. When Beis Hillel says they need another get, what Beis Hillel says is if they want us to Mazel tov, they could definitely stay married, but Lamaisa, should they want to go on and marry other people, would require a second guess. Hey Chidami, what's the case over here? If ultimately, again, there's witnesses, my time at Beis Shammai. So how did Beis Shammai say they don't need another get? And if there are no witnesses, my time at Beis Hillel. What's Beis Hillel's logic? Elalav be'eid echad. So therefore, it must be that what? It must be that halacha l'maisa. It must be halacha l'maisa that there is only one witness. U'letamech. And using that logic, so the Gemara says, "Ema seifa umodim beniskarsha mina erusin." Ultimately, again, everyone agrees that when they are divorced from erusin, she'ein tzvicha hemena get sheni. That there is no need for a second get. Why? Mipnei she'ein libo gaspa. Rabbi says it's interesting. The only time where we are concerned, or we're choshesh, that they were intimate with each other is when Rabbi say, when they had a previous intimate relationship. Now again, husband and wife only lived together after nisuin. So if you have a case ultimately again where they were divorced from Eretzin, which means they never lived together previously, then there's no reason to assume that they were intimate with each other this time as well. But if you think that Eid Echad is believed, Mali mina Eretzin, Mali mina nisuin. Who cares if they got divorced from Eretzin from nisuin? There's an Eid Echad. That should be enough to say that another marriage occurred over here. What's the case? Interesting. So the case over here is Reuben was married to Rachel. They got divorced. Now they're alone together in the same hotel room. So now Rabbi say, so what's the shayla? Now we don't have any eidos that anything happened. All we have is eidos is that they were alone with each other. So we'll say, so what does that mean effectively? And I just want to point out over here, it sounds like there's something illicit. There's nothing illicit that's happening over here, right? In other words, the shaila just is like, do we assume the fact that they were alone with each other means that there was bia, and therefore against second kiddushin? That's the shaila. So Rabbi Shammai says, we'll say Amid Beis lo amrinon hein edei yichud hein edei bia. So we'll say, here we go. So Rabbi Shammai says we do not say that edus for yichud is the equivalent of edus for bia. So therefore, even though we have witnesses that say they were absolutely alone with each other, that's not tantamount to saying that there was bia. So we'll say second line on 65b. Ubesil savri aminan hein edei yichud hein edei bia. Besil says no. We do say that ultimately, again, the same edus for yichud is the same edus for bia. Okay. Umodim vaday ben eskashim min erisin delo aminan hein edei yichud hein edei bia mipnei sheni bagasar. I will say, but we do say halacha l'maisa. We will say that if they got divorced from erisin, then ultimately everyone agrees that Edei Yichud is not Edei Bia. So therefore it turns out that this case actually has nothing to do with our topic. Right? So again, this is a totally separate machlokas. That do we say that Edei Yichud, if you have witnesses that a a divorced couple were alone with each other, do you say that testimony about Yichud, their seclusion with each other, is effectively testimony about Bia or not? That's the machlokas Beisham Beisel. But everyone agrees that if they were divorced from irisin, meaning there was no previous intimate relationship, everyone agrees that Edei Yichud is not Edei Bia. They both say, so that's fascinating, but not at all helpful for our case at hand. Remember, what's our case at hand? Reuben and Rachel come before us. They say, we're married to each other. All we have is an Eid Echad who corroborates their statement. Is an Eid Echad, together with a man and woman who say they're married to each other, is that enough to create the halachic reality of a married couple? So Rabbi Shmuel Silber to Mishnei Derav Hamekadish Be'ed Echad in Choshishin leKiddushin Va'afilu Shnei Hamodim. Okay, so Rabbi says, Rabbi Yitzchak Baruch said the name of Rav, a definitive statement. If Reuven and Rachel ultimately say they're married, and all they could produce is an Eid Echad, irrelevant, or not halachically relevant, or not halachically sound. Amar Rabba Barafuna Hamekadish Be'ed Echad. Beidina Rabba Amri in Choshishin leKiddushin. So this Rabba Barafuna said, if a man is mekadesh a woman be'ed echad, the great Beis Din said the Kiddushin is not valid. Man Beidina Rabba. I will say, who is the great Beis Din? So the Gemara says, my Beidina Rabba, Rav. It's Rav. Ve'ike da'amri Amar Rabba Barafuna Amar Rav Hamekadish be'ed echad Beidina Rabba Amri in Choshishin leKiddushin. So also just an alternate version of this. Man is the Kaddish woman with the Eid Echad. The great Beis Din said the Kiddushin is not valid. Man Beidina Rabba. Ultimately, again, who is the great Beis Din? Rebbe. Okay, so we'll say two versions, but the good news is both versions are saying the same exact thing, which is that if a man is Mekadesh a woman, ultimately, again, with an Eid Echad, again, the chap is, even if both of them are admitting is the wrong word, both of them are claiming, we are in fact married to each other, halacha l'maisa, that's that Kiddushin is not halachically sound or valid. Incredible. So Masev Rav Achtabai Bar Ami, so we'll say, so Rav Achtabai Bar Ami raises a kasha, Shnayim Sheba Medina Sayam. Listen to this, it's a great case, listen to this case. Right? Three people come, right? Shnayim Sheba Medina Sayam, Ishaymayim. Three people come from overseas. Ruvain, Shimon, and Rachel. Okay, now watch this. V'chavila iman. I want to say there's a package of goods. Taltalin, movable property along with them. Now watch this. Ze omer, zo ishti, v'ze avdi, v'zo chavilasi. I want to listen to this. Ruvain claims, this lady Rachel, she's my wife. That guy Shimon, he's my servant. That package, it's mine. V'ze omer, zo ishti, v'zo avdi, v'ze chavilasi. But it sounds like kaparos. So it says, listen to this. So now you have counterclaims, right? Ruvain's claiming, Rachel's my wife, Shimon's my servant, the package is mine. Shimon is claiming, Rachel's my wife, Ruvain's my servant, and the package is mine. Now get ready for this. V'isha omeres, this is great. Rachel claims, Elu shnei avodai. Reuven and Shimon are both my servants, v'chavila shali, and the package is mine. So it's great, right? Show up. Right? Can you imagine you're in Beis Din that day? You get this case like, I should have slept in. Right? So what do we do over here? So what do we do with this case? Tzricha shnei gittin. Shabbos says, so now in this case, Rachel's going to require 2 gittin. Right? She's going to require a get from Ruvain, a get ultimately again from Shimon. Vegovek ksuvasa min chavila. It's interesting. And she collects her ksuva from the package. So essentially, she's going to require a get from both of them, because both are claiming that she is their wife. Right? Ultimately, again, but once there's a marriage, so to speak, she's entitled to a ksuva. She'll collect her ksuva ultimately again from the package that they are holding. Rashi says over here, look at Rashi, tzricha shnei gittin. Rashi says, almost right across in Tosas, Amr lo. So Rashi says, K'dei ligbos ksuvasa min hachavila, k'lomar the olum hachavila munachas ad shava elio. That was saying, in reality, the package is maman amutal b'safek, which means money that we don't know who the owner is. So whenever you have money that you don't know who the owner is, what do? I know it could produce testimony, right? It's ultimate munach at shiyavo elio. You kind of leave it. You just leave it. No one could claim it. So, however, if they give her a get, if both of them give her a get, then Allah she could collect her ksuva from the package. Now, what's the case? So we'll say, if both Ruvain and Shimon have witnesses who say that halacha l'maisa, what? That halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, that they've witnessed, they have testimony that they married her, then does Rachel have the ability to make a claim that both of these guys are my servants and the package is mine? Rather than both say, it must be that what? We must be talking about over here a case of an Eid Echad. A case of an Eid Echad. V'tizbara, I don't understand. So let's say each of them are producing an Eid Echad. What does that do? V'tizbara, Eid Echad ba'achosha mimehemen. Let's say if you contradict an Eid Echad, in other words, even if you want to say an Eid Echad is believed somehow, some way, that's only if what? That's only if the testimony of the Eid Echad is not contradicted. But if somebody is contradicting the testimony of the Eid Echad, then why would the Eid Echad have any believability, any credibility? So the Gemara says, "V'tizbra Eid Echad ba'achosha mimehemen ela l'mishrei la'alma." So we'll say, rather we're trying to figure out over here halacha l'maisa, how does Rachel kind of emerge from this situation? Because remember again, what you have over here is Reuven claiming Rachel is his wife, Shimon claiming Rachel is his wife. So we'll say, what's the halacha? So we'll say, so ultimately again, everyone's going to agree that Rachel is not bound to either of these individuals. So the Gemara says, V'hacha, haki kamar, this is what it means to say, tzricha shnei gittin kedei ligbos ksuvasa min hachavila. So I will say, in reality, Rachel doesn't need a get. Right? Rachel doesn't need a get. Rachel doesn't need anything. She is permitted. If Rachel wants to collect her ksuva, so to speak, from that package, then she's going to require a get both from Ruvain as well as from Shimon. Rabbi Meir the Amru, and it's reflexive of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says metaltali mishtabdi l'ksuva. Now we'll say, now in general, by the way, the fact that she could collect the ksuva from movable property is interesting, because in general, the lien against ksuva initially devolves upon real property. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that the lien of ksuva devolves even upon movable property, and therefore, technically speaking, when Ruvain and Shimon make this claim against Rachel, she doesn't need anything from them. However, if she wants to collect her ksuva from this package, then she's going to require a get from both of them. Okay, fascinating. So the Gemara says, "My havi Allah." All right, the Gemara says, let's stay on task over here, right? In other words, we have a simple question. Well, it's not so simple. We have a simple question. Reuven and Rachel are agreeing that they're married to each other. There's no machlokes over here. The problem is the only corroboration of this fact is in Eid Echad. So does corroboration through an Eid Echad, does that affect reality or not? My havi Allah. So what is the bottom line? So Rav Kahana Amar in Choshesh and Kiddushin. Rav Kahana says no, an Eid Echad will say doesn't do anything. Doesn't do anything. Rav Papa Amar Choshesh and Kiddushin. Rav Papa says we are Choshesh for Kiddushin. We are Choshesh for Kiddushin. Armoli Rav Ashi Rav Kahana. My daitech. So Rav Ashi says Rav Kahana, right? Why is it that you say that we're not Choshesh for Kiddushin with an Eid Echad? So the Yalf is davar mimaman. So maybe you'll say like this. Where do we learn? I will say why. This goes back to the beginning of Kiddushin. I will say, how do you know that Kiddushin needs eidos? Davar from mammon. Right? I will say again, we equate Kiddushin with monetary matters. Just like monetary matters need what? two witnesses to create halachic reality, so too Kiddushin requires two witnesses to create halachic reality. Say if you have one witness, even though husband and wife are admitting that they're married, halakha said that is not enough. So Rav Kahana, is that your logic? Is that your logic? Well, if that's the case, Ima la'alan hodas baldin k'mei edim dami af kan hodas baldin k'mei edim dami. But 1 second, okay. If you want to make a gzera shava of davar from marriage to mamon, and you're going to say just like mamon requires two witnesses in order to affect reality, so too by Kiddushin you need two witnesses to affect reality. But 1 second, by mamon Rabbi say even fasting halacha, which is what? Hodas baldin k'mei edim. If I walk over to Reuven, I say, Reuven, I owe you $1,000. We'll say, what's the impact of that statement? What's the statement? I owe him $1,000. Hodas baldin, in other words, admission is like 1,000 witnesses. If that's the case, then why not go ahead and say the same thing by Kiddushin? Therefore, Rabbi say, both Reuven and Rachel are admitting that they are married to each other, then ultimately, again, that's hodas baldin. And that should create a reality as well. Amrlei, Rav Kahana says, no, that's not a fair statement. Hasam lo kachayev la'achrini, hacha kachayev la'achrini. He will say, interestingly enough, if I admit that I owe Reuven $1,000, that statement is believed. Why? Because it doesn't have an impact on anyone else. Lamaisa, when Reuven and Rachel said that they're married to each other, both say that impact, that statement has a ripple effect on many other people, right? His relatives to her relatives to him. So therefore, I'm going to say it's interesting. Hodas baldin k'mei edim. If you want to, so to speak, admit, make yourself liable to something, that's fine when the statement only impacts you. But the moment the statement ultimately, again, goes ahead and impacts someone else, we're not going to go ahead and believe it. Incredible. So the Marzucha of Rav Ada Saba, interesting case, we won't say just a side case over here. Marzucha of Rav Ada Saba, B'nei de Rav Mari Bar Isser. Marzucha Bosai and Rav Ada Saba were the sons of Rav Mari. What happens? Rav Mari died. That will say there was an estate to go ahead and split up. So what happens? Palik nechasayu bahadi hadadi. So the two sons, Marzutra and Ravada, divided up the estate. They divided up. Right? Now what happened? This is actually fascinating. Ravashi. They came before Ravashi. Amrulei, apishnain edim amrachmana. Now both said, here's what happened. They divided up the estate, but there was no edus on their transaction. So they come before Ravashi and they said like this. The Torah says, Al pi shnei edim yakum davar, right? Al pi shnei edim yakum davar, right? Ultimately, again, right? Al pi shnei edim or al pi shlosh edim yakum davar. Torah says, through the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, something is established as fact. So they asked Ravashi, listen to this. Why? What does that mean? Di ba'ila mehadru lamatzi hadri behu, va'ala lo hadri. So both say, what they were asking was like this. Why do you need eidos on a transaction? Is eidos on a transaction to ensure that no one reneges or no one kind of like tries to lie about what happened? And if that's the case, ultimately, again, we're brothers. We get along fine. We agree to the division. There's no problem. Or maybe transactional reality is only established through testimony. So it's like, this is a fascinating shaila. What they were asking Ravashi was, so again, it's actually a beautiful story. 2 brothers who got along, didn't fight over money, divided up their father's estate just fine, and everybody was talking to each other. Then they realized like, oh, do we need witnesses to this transaction? They come before Ravashi, and essentially what they were asking was like this. What is the role of testimony? Is testimony to ensure that no one lies, no one cheats, no one steals, no one reneges? Or is testimony just like a cog in the wheel of creating transactional reality? Right? And you need testimony in order to create transactional reality. Fasting chakira. And so I will say, what's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is us, the 2 brothers. We're good. We're good. We're not going to lie. We're not going to cheat. We're not going to steal. We're not going to renege. So if testimony is to ensure that no one, pulls any shtick, we're not going to pull shtick. But if testimony is there to solidify transactional reality, then maybe we need that in order to go ahead and affirm or concretize transactional reality. It's fascinating, such a fascinating shailan testimony. Is testimony to ensure the integrity of the transaction, that no one lies, or here's what it is. Is testimony there to ensure the integrity of the parties, or is testimony there to ensure the integrity of the transaction? That's their shaila. So Ravashi said, Amar lahu, lo ivru sadi ela l'shakri. Listen to this. So he answered, witnesses were only created for liars, which is another way of saying, we'll say, testimony is not there for transactional integrity. Testimony is there for personalistic integrity. It is there to ensure the integrity of the parties. Therefore, again, Rav Ashi says to the two brothers, if you guys are good with each other and you don't need Eidus, your division stands without Eidus at all. Rabbi say, beautiful. Remember, we still haven't answered our question, which is, what happens, halacha l'maisa, if Reuben is Mekadosh Rachel, right? And there's Eid Echad, does that stand by itself? We'll stop over here for today, and we'll answer that tomorrow. Bosai, what a daf, shkoyach. You did good. You did good. Hashem.